We all know slavery was a horrible chapter in human history, but what do you really know about life on the slave ships? Picture this. It's the year 1525, and the Atlantic Ocean stands as a bleak canvas for a harrowing voyage, a voyage not of discovery, but of despair. From that year until 1866, the world would witness a chapter of history that would forever stain humanity's conscience. Over the course of those dark centuries, approximately 12.5 million Africans were torn from their homeland and forcibly transported across the Atlantic, embarking on a journey that almost 1.8 million would not survive. This grim odyssey was known as the Middle Passage. Are you ready to discover what daily life on the ships looked like and why those 1.8 million didn't survive the journey? Let's talk about the ships first. European merchants had perfected the art of constructing vessels capable of transporting hundreds of enslaved individuals on each perilous journey. These ships were designed with extra portholes for ventilation, weapons mounted on deck in case of rebellion, and additional compartments below deck to maximize human cargo. The smallest ships had room for just 30 slaves, while the biggest ships could transport up to 100 crew members and 700 slaves. Most slaves were taken from West Central Africa. Before boarding these ships in African port cities, enslaved individuals were subjected to a dehumanizing process. Stripped of their clothing and remaining possessions, they had their heads forcibly shaved. The act of shaving their heads symbolized the erasure of their identity and their humanity. It was a deliberate and degrading act meant to break their spirits. Boarding itself was no swift affair, often taking weeks or even months. During this time, the enslaved people lived on the deck of the ship within a temporary wooden structure constructed by the crew. The makeshift shelter provided minimal protection from the elements, and the enslaved were exposed to harsh weather conditions. It was a time of uncertainty and dread, as they had no idea what awaited them in the New World. So why didn't they escape the ship as soon as possible? Well, netting was draped around the deck to capture those who might choose death over forced servitude. Many enslaved individuals, faced with the horrors of their impending journey, contemplated jumping into the unforgiving ocean to escape their grim fate. The netting served as a macabre safety measure to prevent such desperate acts. On the deck, a barricade stood as a stark reminder of their subjugation, designed to protect the crew from any perceived threat of revolt. In their brief hours of reprieve, forced exercise became a perverse form of entertainment, a cruel dance of suffering, where weary bodies were compelled to move for the amusement of their captors. Those who resisted were treated very cruelly. They used a painful whip called the cat o' nine tails to hurt people who disobeyed. Refusing to eat their small meals of rice and beans was punished with a tool called the speculum oris, which hurt people's mouths and left them in pain. For the women, their horror took on a more insidious form, as they grappled not only with the inhumane conditions, but also with the constant threat of sexual abuse by the crew. Many arrived in the New World bearing the children of their attackers, a brutal reminder of the horrors they faced. Despite their vulnerability, it was these women who often organized acts of resistance. Their courage speaks to the indomitable spirit that found a way to survive and resist, however fleeting and often unsuccessful these acts of rebellion might have been. But if it was in the traders' best interest to keep slaves alive, why did 1.8 million Africans die? We'll dive into this now. Below deck, the slaves would find themselves crammed into compartments with ceilings so low that standing was impossible. These compartments were segregated by gender and age, further intensifying the anguish of separation. Adult men, shackled in pairs, were kept separately from women, who were usually left unchanged in their designated area. The cramped and airless conditions within the ship made it nearly impossible to move, exacerbating their suffering. About 26% of passengers were children, who were the only ones that could freely move about the ship. In the midst of such inhumanity, the children's presence was a haunting reminder of the generations torn apart and the innocence lost during this harrowing voyage. Sanitary facilities were a cruel joke, a macabre theater of despair. The enslaved, already stripped of their dignity and humanity, were condemned to relieve themselves where they sat. The putrid air hung heavy with despair, and the relentless filth served as a breeding ground for the grotesque specter of disease. Dysentery racked their bodies with violent spasms and left them withering in agony. Malaria, like a silent assassin, crept into their febrile minds, stealing their strength with each debilitating chill. Yellow fever painted its victims a ghastly hue, and smallpox marred their bodies with poxmarks, a cruel testament to their suffering. Then we also had measles and influenza, adding to the list of deadly diseases. So, with the harsh conditions and the breakout of diseases, it's no wonder so many didn't make it. But let me tell you another story of how many slaves lost their lives, apart from diseases. It's about slave ship Zong. The haunting tale of the slave ship Zong remains one of the most chilling chapters in the history of the Middle Passage. In the scorching August of 1781, this ill-fated vessel embarked on its journey from the shores of present-day Ghana with destination Jamaica. Aboard the ship, 442 enslaved souls found themselves trapped in a floating hell, surrounded by the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The crew struggled with navigational errors, therefore delaying the journey. 2 months into the ordeal, the crew faced a horrifying reality. The dire conditions on the ship, including overcrowding, malnutrition, accidents, and disease, took the lives of several sailors and approximately 62 African captives. Now the situation was as follows. If the enslaved individuals died on shore, the Liverpool shipowners would have had no recourse with their insurers. Similarly, if they died a natural death at sea, insurance claims were not applicable. However, if some of the enslaved people were deliberately thrown overboard to save the rest of the cargo or the ship, then a claim could be made under the principle of general average. The ship's insurance covered the loss of slaves at a rate of £30 per person, which influenced the crew to consider the distressing proposal of disposing of some of the enslaved individuals. The captain agreed, and they started to throw people overboard, a horrific act that later on would shock the world. In total, 142 Africans lost their lives by the time the ship reached Jamaica. The crew contended that the Africans had been jettisoned because the ship lacked enough water to sustain them all for the remainder of the journey. This explanation, however, faced later dispute, as the ship still had 502 gallons, or 1,900 liters of water when it ultimately arrived in Jamaica. The case was later brought to court, known as the Zong trial, but the court sided with the ship's owners. Despite attempts to obscure the ship's name, British abolitionists ensured that the story was shared widely. They highlighted the truth that such a horrifying tragedy could unfold on any vessel tasked with the grim duty of transporting enslaved individuals across the treacherous Middle Passage. Eventually, it would take more than 2 decades from the Zong trial for the international slave trade to be abolished in both Great Britain and the United States. But the abrogation of the practice of slavery itself would be a long and painful journey, marked by an additional 26 years in England and 58 years plus a devastating civil war in the United States before the shackles of human bondage were finally broken. By the way, don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this. I think we can conclude that the Middle Passage remains a ghostly echo in the annals of history. The suffering of those who endured this harrowing voyage serves as a stark reminder of the unyielding human spirit and the enduring strength of those who survived to bear witness to the darkest periods of our shared history. I'm curious to know what shocked you the most. If you've learned something new, please subscribe and give the video a thumbs up. See you in the next video.